In the fall of 1960, I had just finished my BA at Concordia University in Montreal and was about to take a year off just to find myself. My teacher, my piano teacher, Dorothy Morton, one of the doyens of piano pedagogy in the country, now no longer with us, she made a suggestion. And because I really didn't know what I was going to do to find myself, or find anything else for that matter. And she said, why don't you spend a year practicing seriously for once? You never have as long as I've known you, which was a long time. And she was right. And I decided, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to open up a studio and do a bit of teaching and a lot of practicing. So she assigned me a piece by Schumann entitled Kreisleriana. Now, I'd never even heard of it at that time, but I got the music and I sight read it, and I said, I was captivated, I really was. It didn't sound like anything else I had ever played. And so I set about to learn it, and I did work hard, and a few months later, I actually played it in a recital, and shortly afterward, I recorded it for the CBC. The CBC at that time used to record a lot of concerts going on in the country. Now they have other things, obviously better things to do with the taxpayers' money. But I have to say, I recently listened to that old tape, and I have to say it was not too bad for a talented kid who still didn't know very much about music or playing the piano, and absolutely bupkis about German Romantic poetry. What amazed me most about the recording wasn't my youthful bravado, but that voice that announced me. I said, I know that voice. I said, that was Peter Jennings, the Peter Jennings, long before North America knew him as the anchor of ABC's TV news. He was Canadian. He lived in Ottawa. Decades later, I'm not talking about my own career at this point, there was a long involuntary sabbatical from the piano, occasioned first by COVID, which interrupted the playing careers of any musician I know, and then other health concerns prolonged the absence. And so when I finally returned to the piano about a year ago, it felt like I was a beginner. Progress was slow, fingers reluctant, muscles uncertain, memory temperamental, and frankly it still is. It almost was like starting from scratch again. But I did work hard, and it turned into one of the most enjoyable periods of practicing I've ever done. And it's really reassuring to learn that even in one's, why don't I just say it, my upper 80s, an old dog may not be able to learn too many new tricks, but he can pick up the old ones pretty easily. And so here I am revisiting the first Schumann piece I ever loved. So I'm going to talk about it. Let's begin the story about Kreisleriana. It doesn't begin with Schumann. It begins, believe it or not, with a cat, a tomcat named Mur. You get the idea. 2 centuries ago, the writer, the artist, and musician, all one person, E.T.A. Hoffmann, wrote his final and most original novel entitled The Life and Opinions of the Tomcat Mur. Yeah, that's the same Hoffmann who inspired the ballets The Nutcracker and Coppelia, and Offenbach's opera, The Tales of Hoffmann. Now, Mur is no ordinary feline. He's pretty smart. He teaches himself to read and write. He educates himself into what he imagines is a creature of high culture and becomes insufferably proud of it. And he decides to write his memoirs. But cats just can't go to the stationery store and buy paper. I mean, not done. So when his master is out of the house, he tears out several pages from an unfinished manuscript in the library of his owner, who is a kind man he refers to as Master Abraham. It was an unfinished biography of an equally fictional musician named Johannes Kreisler. Mur uses the reverse blank sides of the stolen paper to write his own memoir. Now, Hoffmann's conceit is that the fictional publisher, noting that both sides of the paper contained text, failed to realize that he had 2 completely separate manuscripts in his hands. Now, since his job description from his guild stipulates that he prints everything he's handed, that's what he does. So as the reader turns each page, the book ricochets back and forth between the vanity of a self-satisfied cat and the torments of a hypersensitive genius. Schumann adored this novel. He saw himself in it, the genius, the fool, the dreamer, the sufferer, and the satirist. And Kreisleriana is his own musical translation of that dual existence. Let's say a bit more about Robert Schumann. He has the same initials that I do and the same first name. Now, lesser important things. He was born in 1810 in Zwickau, which is a town in Saxony. Germany at that time wasn't unified, as I'm sure most of you know, into a very comfortable and educated family. He showed his talent and intelligence early on. At piano, he wasn't all that accomplished, but he could do things like improvise at the piano, capturing the mannerisms of his friends and relatives, the idioms, so perfectly that everyone in the room would collapse with laughter. And literature fascinated him just as much as music did, equally so. By the time he was in his teens, he had devoured much of what he could get hold of, all of Schiller, Goethe, Heine, and his 2 lifelong idols, Hoffmann and Jean-Paul Richter. He even attempted 2 novels on his own when he was a teenager, and I think we're probably lucky that they're lost. After graduation from what we would call high school, very shortly, his sister died, and then his father, suddenly. And he was very hurt by all this, very much. And his widowed mother, worried about his future, said, "What's going to happen?" And she asked her brother, "What are we going to do with him?" And they decided to send him to Leipzig to go into law school. Well, that didn't last too long. He dropped out. He joined a group of literary bohemians and but at the same time, he started studying piano seriously with the best piano teacher in town, a man named Friedrich Wieck. And he was the father of Clara Wieck, whom Schumann would ultimately marry after a tumultuous courtship fraught with as many legal and personal obstacles as Wieck can place in front of them. Now, there are many stories, novels, and movies about the Robert-Clara romance, and often including the period when the younger Brahms entered their lives and complicated them even more. And almost invariably, all these stories, Schumann and Clara loved each other, and Friedrich was a monster. Not true. Wieck was not a monster he's portrayed as. How would any of you who have children feel if you had a student, you're a piano teacher, you had a student well into his 20s who admittedly, the piano student is intelligent and prodigiously talented. He has also just broken off a formal engagement with a young lady when he found out that she was illegitimate, and so she would not inherit her father's title or fortune. Moreover, the guy is psychologically unstable much of the time and often drunk. And now he's attracted to your 13-year-old daughter, who's already, by the way, the most famous female pianist in the world. And her life is ahead of her. Every story always has two sides, always. Except for this, well, never mind. The person who asked me how much I paid the critic for Fanfare for that good review, and which is a true story. Schumann ultimately decided to become a concert pianist and worked obsessively at it. And he went so far as to invent a fearsome-looking device called a chiroplast, designed to strengthen the constrained fourth finger everybody in this room is born with. If you play the piano, you know you can't lift the fourth finger, neither as high. You just don't have the strength at the keyboard that all four other digits have. Whether it was the fault of that device, a bad case of focal dystonia, or sheer excess of ambition and hard work, he permanently injured his hand. Hopes for a performing career were dashed, and composition would become his new life. And it's hard being a composer then, because you had three people, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, all of whom were really geniuses with humongous reputations, and they poured their energies into, together, all told, a bit over 100 long sonatas, most of which are works of genius. And Schumann, I mean, how many, if you want to start writing sonatas, you don't want to do that all the time because other people have done it too. And he preferred writing in shorter forms, miniatures, character pieces. He thought in musical aphorisms, not architecture. Still, it was not long before he began grouping such short pieces into longer works with titles, pianistic equivalent of, let's say, romantic song cycles, like his famous Carnival, Davidsbündler, and of course, Kreisleriana. Given his love of literature, it was not long before he also turned to writing essays and music criticisms. And his family wasn't poor. He founded a magazine called Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, the new journal for music. It still exists to this day. Different owners, different everything, but it exists. And he wrote reviews for it and essays. And in his first issue, he hailed Chopin. Hats off, gentlemen, a genius. And his last essay, written in 1853, proclaimed Brahms as the future of German music. He had pretty good critical acumen. In those articles, he often wrote, sometimes in his own voice, but sometimes in the voices of two alter egos he invented. Florestan, a fiery and impulsive guy, and Eusebius, dreamy, inward. And they became the central characters of an imaginary group of musicians called the Band of David, or Davidsbündler, whose mission, who did David defeat? The Philistines, right? In the Bible. Well, the mission here was to counter what several British and German scholars and writers in the 19th century termed Philistines, not biblical ones, but rather wealthy people indifferent to or hostile to art, literature, and intellectual life. And they liked comfort, convention, gold carpeting, gold mirrors, gold walls, gold everything, over imagination, risk, and poetic. Before long, Schumann introduced those personae that I talked about, Florestan and Eusebius, into his own compositions. And nowhere are they more vividly and subtly portrayed than in Kreisleriana and another contemporaneous masterpiece that he also wrote in Vienna, Humoresque. Kreisleriana was composed in 1838, while, as I said, he was residing in Vienna. And for several months, he was waiting impatiently for Clara to turn 21 so they could marry without her father's permission, which they did. Just say a couple of things about dates. 1838, Kreisleriana was written, so it was humoresque, and this is when he resided in Vienna. 1938 was the year of my birth. Okay, now, I know you're not going to believe this, but Clara and Robert had many children, and the youngest of them was a woman named Eugenia, and she lived into my lifetime. She died in 1938. It's unbelievable. You think, oh my God, that's history. That's such a long time. But their youngest child, and I overlap by a few months. Anyway, Schumann composed the entire work in a single week, a white heat of inspiration, if ever there was one. And he says this to Clara in a letter. He said, I thought of you constantly. And I should, this being the Chopin Society, I should mention that Kreisleriana is dedicated to, quote unquote, his friend Chopin. Now, in all fairness, don't get too mad at me, the emotional warmth and charitableness that friendship flowed was much freer from Schumann's side to Chopin than from Chopin's side to Schumann. That's another story, but you can read up on it if you want. Later, he would revise and smooth over rough edges of his earlier pieces. A lot of his early pieces have two versions, including this one, but I often prefer the earlier ones. They're less tidy, but they do seem more original and quirkier. Now, Kreisleriana was not Schumann's original. It was his original title, but he was the first person to use it. Hoffmann used it for a collection of stories and essays that he wrote about that alter ego of his, Johannes Kreisler, way back in 1815. By adopting that title, Schumann acknowledged his lineage. He too was a divided soul, half poet and half madman. And his Kreisleriana consists of 8 contrasting pieces, none very long, except for one moves on a little bit. But he called them fantasies originally, and they were meant to be heard as a continuous whole, a song cycle without words. And his imagination is at its freest here. Phrases don't quite fit together. Cross currents of rhythm, tuple against triple. Accents everywhere except where one would think they are supposed to be. He courts chaos, the feeling of perpetual unbalance, as though the floor is tilting underfoot. Now, you can bet that his 2 imaginary friends, Florestan and Eusebius, alternate throughout this. They do in quite a few of his music, but here they aren't mentioned. They're just there. And Hoffmann's figures, Kreisler and Muir, also seem to join them. More than 60 years have passed since I first encountered this music, and I return to it now with different ears, different heart, and yes, a quieter pulse, but no less astonishment at what this man produced. He and Chopin were unquestionably the two great piano composers of, and followed slightly by Liszt in the early mid-19th century. But they are so unbelievably different. And when I play the piece, listen for the sudden storms. Listen for the whispered confidences. Listen for the music and imagine the poetry that inspired it. And listen for the cat.